Sybil Jordan Hampton, and I was the youngest of the 5 students who made up the second class of Negro students desegregating Little Rock Central High School. Little Rock was a segregated but progressive city in the South. As a little girl, I would go downtown to pay the telephone bill for my parents or other bills, and I rode the bus. And my parents trained my brother and myself very carefully to, when we were alone, to know that if you got on the bus, you went to the back of the bus. That if you were in the department store, you looked for things that said colored, whether it was the bathroom or the water fountain, that you did not expect to go into Walgreens and sit at the lunch counter. All of those things are things that are very stark memories for me of the rules that you had to learn. I was part of the second group of students to desegregate the high school. And what was striking on the first day that we went to school, there was just this quiet. And we discovered that while people would certainly not hesitate to call us the N-word a million times a day, there was nothing else. And so the experience of the 3 years was that we were shunned. And at the end of that time, there's absolutely nobody in my homeroom who ever spoke to me. And the struggle shifted, and the struggle was not one in which there was this viciousness or these overt violent or physical acts. It was that the resistance had to be quiet. And it was really quite shocking as time went on to realize that I was always going to be the other, and that there was absolutely nothing that I could do or say in my classes that would ever change the perception of me as being unworthy, not wanted, not welcomed. And so it was my hopes and dreams and my goals, but also my commitment to being in the struggle for my people that kept me on every day being able to keep my head up high, do what I had to do, and never feel that I couldn't go back another day.
Yeah, I was going to say, ladies and gentlemen of Mosaic, Dr. Sybil Jordan Hampton. Sybil, we're so honored to have you today at our church, and we had the chance to speak in the first service as well. Sybil, joining us today is really wonderful, providential. We were at a lunch a few months ago with the former chancellor at UALR, Dr. Joel Anderson, and a handful of others, and had the privilege of speaking out at United Methodist Church, Highland Valley, that's right, Highland Valley, last fall on a series on race. But Sybil and I have known each other for a number of years. We were at the luncheon, and I needed a ride back to Mosaic, and she was headed this way, so I hitchhiked with her. I said, hey, can I catch a ride? And so we ended up, of course, talking in the car. And then I asked her to come in and speak with our staff. It was wonderful. And she was so, just shared her heart, her passion. It was really a magic moment for our staff. And because of that, we're like, we got to get you in front of the people of Mosaic Church. So again, we're so thankful to have you here. I want to just start briefly by asking you what I asked in the first service. You know, we're just 2 or 3 miles or so from Little Rock Central. And when you think back 60 plus years to the mid-50s of Little Rock and of all that we're going to talk about this morning, I hope and I know that it must be encouraging for you to see the people and the passion of this church, the wonderful unity and diversity that people here will themselves actually to walk, work, and worship God together as one. Tell us about that, if you would.
Well, this is one of the fulfillments of a dream that I had when I went to Little Rock Central High School. This church, this place, this feeling, the work that you do is one of the legacies of those of us who made those sacrifices so many years ago to have a place where people, all people who come into the place matter.
Amen. Well, we're going to talk about that sacrifice. Yeah, amen. You know, we did a series in the fall called Hope for All, which is really predicated on hope for all, not just some, right? And Dr. Hampton went on, you may know, to earn her master's degree from the University of Chicago and her PhD in education from Columbia. So the smartest person in the room is sitting right next to me this morning. But yeah, I say all that, though. Let's talk for a moment about Little Rock in the mid-'50s, late '50s. You mentioned in the video it was a progressive city, and when I heard that for the first time, I was like, oh, that's interesting. Tell us about the city of Little Rock in the mid to late '50s as you were growing up as a child, and why did you label it, if you would, a progressive city at that time?
Everything is a matter of perspective, and I grew up on the corner of 7th and Park. And on the corner that I grew up on, in the house that my grandfather built, my parents had a grocery store. And on the adjacent corner was an Anglo grocery store. So that my perspective was being able to see my parents as entrepreneurs, my grandfather as an entrepreneur, but also to have a level of social intercourse with everybody who was in my neighborhood. And so I say progressive because I've been in Mississippi and I've been in the Delta, and I know there's a very different sense of who you are and your possibilities in those places. And everything about where I grew up on 7th and Park led me to feel that there are rich possibilities, but also that people who didn't look like me hated me. I did not grow up with that understanding. I was treated respectfully by the people who were in our neighborhood, and even more so by the men who came to sell the produce and other goods to my parents.
So in terms of the Little Rock Nine, of course, as we've talked before, Little Rock Nine and the historic nature of integration of Central High in '57, in one sense, they get all the attention, not in a bad way, but we're familiar with their story. What we wanted to do is make you familiar with other stories that were in and around that time, as Dr. Hampton represents this morning. And one thing that's interesting about that, maybe most of you know, I don't want to assume that you do, or for people watching online, but in 1957, of course, second stop in the American Civil Rights Movement, Little Rock Central is integrated with 9 African-American students. In 1958, the schools were closed because of essentially white majority saying, fine, we're not going to have that in our city. But it was in 1959 that, again, integration began and the schools were reopened. And, of course, that's where Dr. Hampton was a part of 5 African-American students integrating Central High, or going back to Central High in 1959. She entered at 10th grade. Back then it was 10th through 12th grader. So Dr. Hampton is the first African-American to actually complete her entire high school education from 10th through 12th grade at Central High, which is an amazing achievement. But having said that, 1959, after a year in which the schools were closed, after a year prior to that where there was so much havoc and turmoil and venom, essentially, that was focused on Little Rock Nine, which some of those were your friends too, right? You mentioned some went to church with you, but what was it like for you entering that school, knowing the history of just 2 years before, and give us a sense of what that felt like in the moment and how you were able to walk up those steps for the first day, and not just then, but to stick it out for the coming several years.
It was a joy to grow up in Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church, where 4 of the Little Rock Nine attended, and their parents were my parents' friends, and so that I was not at a distance. I certainly watched TV, was aware of everything that happened, but the motivation, and I think this is very important, sometimes people say to me, the motivation was that you really wanted to have white friends, and I say, au contraire. The motivation was that in order to go to Dunbar, I walked past Little Rock Central High every day, and my brother, who also went the next year, and I would say to ourselves, that's our school. Our parents pay taxes. We should have access to that school, and we also knew it was ranked number 33 in the nation at that time. Going to that school was a commitment to continuing the struggle from slavery of our people to realize the promises of democracy. It was larger than just going to that school. It was to be a part of that thing that was going to open up the society so that we could sit in this room like this today, and that people could have the kind of opportunities that they have, even though all is not perfect today. And so we went not having a clue as to what was going to happen. But I was a child of the King. I knew that from my upbringing. And so I was never afraid. I was daunted. I was dismayed. I was disappointed. But I was never afraid, even in some of the strangest moments, because everything I had been taught as a child growing up in the church resonated with me. It doesn't always happen that way. I didn't choose that, but that was the way in which God blessed me and that God prepared me. And so that I understood that things would happen to me, but I believe that the worst things that had happened to Christ on the cross. And that as a child of God, I was going to do my part, and that suffering was something that was a part of the experience because of the fall.
You know, one part of the story that's fascinating to me, a little bit hard to believe, but is the selection process. We hear a lot about school choice today. Talk about school choice then. You were chosen, right? I mean, this is very interesting, and it wasn't just 1 year, as you shared this morning. It went all the way through 1972. You may not know that, but African-American students were actually chosen and went through a rigorous process to get in. I suppose in some ways demeaning. It certainly wasn't say, hey, we're signing up, but tell us about that whole part of the story that a lot of people don't maybe know or recognize, that selection. How did students get in? How long did that last? What did you have to endure to go into the school?
Little Rock used what's called a pupil placement law. You might Google that. And over time, it became less onerous. But initially, because the school board really did not want to admit in 1959 any more than the two of the Little Rock Nine, Carlotta Walls and Jefferson Thomas, they set up roadblocks. And so there was psychological testing, and there was intelligence testing, and then the final hurdle was that each one of us went in to be interviewed by the all-white male school board. And it was really, that was daunting. And I was placed in 10th grade by myself as the youngest, because the school board members were rather startled that I wasn't startled, and that I was very calm. And if I had been in a situation where I'd never been around white people or talked with powerful white men before, I might have reacted in a different way. But they decided to place me in 10th grade by myself to see if I was really as strong as I appeared to be. And so there's a level of cruelty, you know, that we see there, the kind of thing that they wouldn't want to have happen to their children, that they would visit that on this child because I was an other and I really didn't matter, and they couldn't feel my heart or be concerned about my heart.
Well, you've mentioned your faith, of course, the rock of your fortitude in those days, your parents, Bethel AME Church. These are the things. You also talked about the cafeteria workers who were friends of yours, that they gave you encouragement. Tell us about that.
Young people, never forget that when you are places that everybody is important. And in that school, the only faces who were faces like ours were the people who cleaned and who served the food in the cafeteria. And so you look to your support where your support exists. You cannot see distinctions, and you can't look down on people, because you never know who will reach out and give you the smile that you need to reassure you that you matter. And that happened in the cafeteria.
Yeah, I love how you phrased that earlier, that a nod or a wink or a smile, and even just the words in passing sometimes, keep going, representing the bigger struggle you were faced with at that time. I want us to understand as well, 60 plus years removed from this, you might think that the treatment, the first couple days or first couple weeks was difficult, but this wasn't something that lasted for 2 or 3 days or 2 or 3 weeks. It was 2 or 3 years, and even long after that in terms of class reunions. Tell us about that whole the shunning, the suffering that went on, not in a way to blame others. We're in a series called Love Like You've Never Been Hurt. You're going to share about that in a moment. But I want us to understand this wasn't something that happened for a couple weeks and then it kind of faded. This was something that was really lifelong, or for many, many years, of feeling like the other, being treated or made to feel that way. Tell us about that, and maybe how some of the treatment, the things you endured, were different or similar to the Little Rock Nine.
It was very different for us than the Little Rock Nine, because the city fathers had sent the message that the press was not going to be here and we weren't going to be known as the poster children of, protest or resistance to the federal government. Would you believe that from the first day to the last day, I was in the same homeroom, and in that period of 3 years, no one in that homeroom ever spoke to me? The only person who spoke to me would be the class president or the teacher, and the only thing either of them ever said to me was, "It is your turn to read the Bible." It was most unsettling, but also very strange to be in a place where we were pledging allegiance to the flag every day and reading the Bible, and that I was in a hostile environment. Being shunned is an incredible experience. And I don't think that people shunned me because they hated me. I think they shunned me because they learned at mother's breast that I didn't matter. And young people, that's very important. I never felt hated. I felt that I did not matter. And not mattering happens to lots of people in lots of ways. But I knew that I was not alone, because everything I'd been taught told me that my Savior was with me, and he walks with me, and he talks with me, and he tells me I am his own.
Well, I know you and Harry are going to get into this, but let me ask you just one final question. And this time, we're in a series called Love Like You've Never Been Hurt. And you are a modern example, a living witness of someone who has overcome hurt in order to love all people, not just some people, and particularly those who shunned you, the suffering, etc. How, if you had to put in a single phrase, we've talked about your parents, your faith, the church, how would you help us to say, if you could only say one thing, how do we love like we've never been? How do you overcome that in order to look others in the eye, even those who perpetuated injury or hurt, and able to overcome that? What would be one piece of advice or encouragement you give? And I know you and Harry are going to share more about that in a moment.
The wonderful gift that I got from my church and from my parents had to do with forgiveness. That, forgiveness is at the center of the life of the Christian. That forgiveness was at the center of the life of Christ. And that the way in which Christ drew people to him was to love them first before he admonished them. But the other wonderful lesson that I learned in my family and my church is that don't take it personally. My parents said to me every day, you represent that which these young people have been taught to despise. They don't know who you are, and my mother would say, but if they did, they could love you. But you will maybe not have that chance. And so, young people, it is very important to know that things can happen to you because somebody's having a bad day and they just treat you badly. And then sometimes it's because of your gender. I mean, there are all kinds of reasons. And I just have not spent my life trying to track down why people are in my way or trying to deter me. I spend my life doing what my parents said, and that is doing well is the best revenge.
Amen. Well, doing well is the best revenge. If you would, I shared with you, silver and gold, we don't have a lot around here. We stretch dimes to dollars, but really the highest acknowledgement that we have in our church is what we call the Order of the Cross. It's just a simple little wooden plaque. John Hatton's designs these for us. But it's called the Order of the Cross. And in recognition of who you are, your lifetime of work and labor of love, for this community, for the African Americans in general, and really for humans, human beings and people like us, to be able to stand here. It's an honor for us to give you the Order of the Cross today. Harry, why don't you read that briefly, what's on the back of that, if you would.
On the back of this, it says, "We, the people of Mosaic, do hereby honor Dr. Sybil Jordan Hampton as a recipient of the Order of the Cross, recognizing her persevering faith, enduring love, and hope for all, a modern-day hero of the faith, declared this 9th day of February in the year of our Lord 2020.
Amen.
What a joy and a privilege. And I asked Dr. Hampton to stay with me because, man, there's so much more to cover. And just in the conversation that we had over the phone, it was obvious, this woman has a deep, abiding faith out of which springs hope and life and love and peace. And I'm like, so as soon as that interview's over, we got a lot to talk about, and I want you to stay up there with me because you've got a lot to say. So we've been in this series, Love Like You've Never Been Hurt. And if you think about what love is, let's begin with that, because the scripture is very clear. Love suffers long and kind. Love does not envy, does not parade itself, is not puffed up, does not behave rudely, does not seek its own, is not provoked, thinks no evil, does not rejoice in iniquity, but rejoices in the truth, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. When I read that passage, I think of Sybil Hampton, because that's exactly what I see and I've heard from her over the course of this week as we've had these conversations. And really the point of the series is this: to love like this requires Christ our Lord, requires the power of the Holy Spirit. But it is very natural for us to put up barriers to that love, especially when we've been hurt. And if there's ever a reason for somebody to put up barriers, this is an example of somebody that would be totally justified if she were bitter and angry and hateful for all that's happened in her past. But instead, we see somebody who is able to overcome all that. And so this message is meant for you who are going through the same season of conflict. This message is meant to provide encouragement from somebody who has been there and overcome it, so that you can see you can too. I rewrote this passage. Listen to this. This is the anti-love passage. Wounded love is not long-suffering and kind. Prideful love parades itself and is puffed up. Conditional love behaves rudely and seeks its own. Manipulated love is provoked and thinks of all kinds of evil. Abusive love rejoices in iniquity, does not rejoice in truth, gives up easily, and tries to control all things. And see, if you are mentioned in that passage, if that's the kind of hurt that you've had, I have good news for you today. Christ is able. He is able. He can lift you up. He can give you meaning and purpose and the ability to love despite what this world has thrown in your direction. And so we're going to talk about that today. And so we have for you 3 encouragements, if this is you. If you're going through this season of conflict, we want you to understand 3 things. And the first one is this: God is attracted to weakness. Okay, look at that passage. This is Christ talking to Paul. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses so that Christ's power may rest on me. Now, it's not so much that Christ is attracted to weakness as much as it is people who are in those situations where they are weak and have no other place to turn, naturally turn towards God. God never turns his back on those that are inviting him in. And it's almost like a vacuum. The greater the need, the greater the openness, the greater the desperation, the more God shows up. You know that psalm, it says, God is near the brokenhearted. That's what this is all about. And you know, we talk about you as a 15-year-old young lady, 9th grade, thinking about the cause of her people and being a pioneer so that those behind her could make it a little easier, a little further down the trail as she became this pioneer. And here I was at 15, dreaming of being a rock star. I mean, it's like how somebody could have that depth of maturity at that age is amazing. But how did God show himself to you in those moments where you felt weak, where there were others around you that were trying to make you feel weak in every possible way? And I love what you said. You felt a lot of things, but you never felt any fear. So what would you have to say about, how did God make his power perfect in you during those times?
All of life before I went to Central was a rehearsal, young people. I couldn't have gone there and been successful if I didn't come with the right stuff. And so I had already lived my life learning and believing. Trust and to step out on faith. And on that first day, I knew I was taking a faith walk, but I knew that I was not walking alone. And I never, ever felt that God was not there with me.
Amen and amen to that. Young people, this is for you right here. This is for you. In that verse it says, my grace is sufficient for you. We call it the great equalizer, right? Because where we may appear weak, God adds his power and his grace, and you end up with power perfected. And in these moments, we were talking about just how much God poured his grace on you, even in the midst of those 3 years. Like the cafeteria workers, I bet you always got the biggest portions and the biggest dessert, didn't you? But God is full of grace, and he provides us with those things every step along the way. So young people especially, remember this. If you're going through a season of conflict, number one, God is attracted to you in those moments. Your life matters. You can walk and not have any fear at all if Christ is at the center. Amen? Secondly, remember this. It's a season, not a sentence. All right? If you look at this life and what's happening to you as somehow a life sentence, then everything that happens to you is going to point to a God who's out to get you. And you'll shake your fists and question him every step along the way. Look at what Ecclesiastes says about this. Farmers who wait for perfect weather never plant. If they watch every cloud, they never harvest. Just as you cannot understand the path of the wind or the mystery of a tiny baby growing in its mother's womb, so you cannot understand the activity of God who does all things. Plant your seed in the morning and keep busy all afternoon, for you do not know if profit will come from one activity or another, or maybe both. How's that for some advice? Now, think about the farmer. If the farmer thought that season was actually his life sentence, then every cloud that came by was just confirmation that God's out to get him. Every time something bad happened he would just be giving up. There would be no harvest, no planting. So what does this passage say? That if you are in the middle of a season of conflict, keep sowing seeds of righteousness, faith, hope, joy, love. Keep sowing them. Because you know what happens? As you sow those seeds, I'm convinced that's what God uses the most to bring about a wonderful, bountiful harvest in the next season. That's where you reap what you sow. And so if you're going through a season of conflict, be all the more committed to living it out, to sowing those right seeds. I was thinking that today, I wish I had a time machine. I could send you back to 1959, fall. I would love to hear what Dr. Sybil Hampton of today would share with 15-year-old Sybil Hampton on that first day walking into that whole 3 years. Hey, before you do that, though, let's get every young person, 20 years and under, would you stand up, please? Everybody, there we go. Look at this. Yes. You guys, stay on your feet for a minute, okay? Imagine you were getting bullied not by one person, not by two people, but by every person in the class along with your teachers. Could you endure that for 3 years? All right, so here standing before you is somebody who's endured that. And look how she is today. Yes. This is a living, breathing example for you to follow. And she is about to speak words of life into you right now. So you better listen and take everything she has to say to heart. Lay it on them.
I'm here today, young people, to say that my story from the past matters to you. You have to stand with history. You have to have a knowledge of what has gone on before, for better and for worse. And then you have to be fully in the present of your life. And I was fully in the present of my life, and the only thing I had control over that I now realize that I would say to myself was being a good student. Stay focused, stay focused, stay focused. No one could take that from me. But I also had my eye on the future, and so that I was in it for the long game. I was not certain how much I would be able to achieve there. I did my best for the cause, but I also had my eye on going on, pressing on, and taking everything that I learned there into a future that I hoped would be a future for my people to realize the promises of democracy. And guess what? I was the blessed one who really was a part of that first group of students. And I didn't know that when I started, but because you don't know that doesn't mean that you won't be the rich, blessed beneficiary, so you've got to work like that.
Amen. Awesome. Thank you. You guys can have a seat. But I want you to remember what you just said, right? You should always have an eye to the future. Number one, this season will pass. Every one of us who are in this room, 50, 60 years beyond our teenage years, every one of us would probably tell you much the same thing. We make mistakes. We're immature. I was thinking about where am I going to get my next set of guitar strings, right? But if you can begin thinking about the future, who you want to be, who God has called you to be, what would you like to see him do through you? You know, that's the kind of stuff that in another 50, 60 years, you could be sitting right here encouraging those in the room as well. That's a powerful, powerful testimony. That's awesome. All right, so God is attracted to weakness, It's a season. It's not a sentence. Lastly, your pain has a purpose. You know, there's something about us humans, when we go through difficult, painful things, it usually changes us. I'm not quite sure why that is, but usually the only change I see happening to people, including myself, comes when times are difficult and when times are painful. How I wish we were a people that when times were good and great, that's when we'd fall on our knees and say, oh God, change me. We're not that way though. Instead, it's only when there's pressure applied, when we're in the crucible. And look at what he does through your pain. That first passage, when you're going through that, he comforts you. Miss Sybil found comfort in the midst of her pain. And now look at what she's doing. She's comforting you all with the very comfort that she was comforted with. The more we suffer for Christ, the more God will shower us with his comfort through Christ. So right now, you're being comforted with a waterfall, Niagara Falls of comfort, because of what this woman endured for 3 long, painful years. And likewise, Miss Sybil's the one that brought this verse up while we were talking on the phone. Don't forget about that verse from Joseph. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for all for good. He has a purpose behind it that's so much beyond what you see and what you feel. So don't let that pain drive you towards unforgiveness, bitterness, anger, selfishness, depression. Let it drive you towards the things that give you life, the fruit of the Spirit. So, as someone who's lived this out, what purposes have you seen come out of the 3 years that you spent at Central?
I think that I would have been, as a very talented young person before Central, so focused on myself. And as a result of being treated as if I didn't matter, I knew that I had to have a life in which I witnessed to something different from that. And my life became more purposeful, more spirit-driven, because without Christ at the center of my life and without the dedication that I've had to making a difference in the world, I could have become an axe murderess. And I say to young people who tell me how angry they are, what are you talking about? I had an experience that potentially created an axe murderess. So cool your jets.
Amen. Amen. That's great. That's the most Twitterable quote right there, right? I could have been an axe murderess, so cool your jets. Real quickly before we close, we had a conversation at the end of on our phone call, and I just thought it was a profound observation. We were talking about the process of healing, and who owns that process of healing. You know, and you know, for many of you in this room, you probably are far removed from the events of 1957 through 59 here in Little Rock. I mean, my parents are born in China, right? And so I knew very little about that before coming here. But I tell you this much. She said, we collectively, every single one of us in this room, while we may not own the offense, we own the process of healing. Okay, so speak a little bit about that and what you meant by that.
So often people say to me, this is a problem that black people and white people are going to have to come together and resolve. And I always think, au contraire, that if we teach every child to respect and to love every other child, and to respect God and God's purposes in those children, then we create an environment and a community where the kind of thing that I experience can't happen. And it takes everybody doing that. It doesn't take people trying to say, I didn't do it, I'm not guilty. And so much energy goes into standing back from all of the things that have happened that we don't work collectively to understand that we have power, and the power is in the goodness that we know that the Lord wants to see fulfilled here on earth in terms of the types of communities that he worked with the disciples to build, and that we have the example of what we need to do in order to ensure that the things that happen to people who look like me, but also to the Japanese Americans who were incarcerated, or to Muslims who are now being, it's all a ball of wax, and that this black-white continuum has meaning, but that meaning has to bump up to other levels because it is larger than what goes on that continuum. If we don't solve the problem of us as people, as human beings, then the black-white thing just continues to be disgusting and to have other kinds of ramifications.
Awesome. Amen. Amen. Well, it's been an absolute joy to get to know you, and I feel like I have a kindred spirit. You know, just within the first 15 minutes of the conversation, it was like, man, this woman has a heart of peace. This woman has deep faith. She's a woman of prayer and faith. And it was such an honor and very humbled to be sitting with you today.